So good afternoon, everyone. First of all, I would like to thank the organizers for this very difficult but very thought-provoking undertaking of this hybrid conference. I'm happy to be in Dublin, not in person, but still not physically, but still from Krakow. Today, I would like to share with you a part of my research concerning policies of translation in interwar Poland. Even in the title of my presentation, compared to the title of the panel, you can see some possible tensions. For example, the historical versus sociological, past versus future, policies versus practices, etc. I will illustrate complex relationships between those notions by focusing on the case study of Rocznik Literacki, the annual published in 1930s in Poland. And also I would like to present some initial intuitions on the possible future of translation history, especially in the Polish context. This is the overview of my presentation. First, I will provide you with a socio-political context of interwar Poland. Then I will move to the methodological part. And first of all, I will answer the question why I decided to analyze this particular material and from this particular period using translation studies tools, especially tools from translation history, in relation to the notion of translation policy, which is, as we know, usually identified with the subdiscipline of the sociology of translation. And then I will move on to my case study. I will justify the choice of this particular periodical. I will trace the position of translation in the annual and identify some general strategies and norms regarding translation in the annual and in that period, and say a few words about some fluctuations, shifts, and individual policies of translation. The interwar period in Poland was a short period of time, only 2 decades, but it was very dynamic. Just to remind you, it was a time when Poland regained its independence after over 100 years of foreign occupation. It was the time when Poland was a multilingual and multicultural state with a very big Jewish population, Jewish minority. Also, it was a time when we can observe a flourishing book and press market. It was very fast developing, but also very chaotic, and a boom of various translations, especially from English. And that leads us to another important aspect of the linguistic interplay. French, which was considered as lingua franca before, now had to step out because of English, and English was considered at that time as a language of the future. And this implementation of modernity happened on different levels, on the social level, on the cultural level, and also in literature as well. So this is the perspective from the interwar period as such. But for me, the most important is the contemporary perspective. Nowadays, interwar period is very popular in everyday life, in Polish culture, in non-fiction books, for example, and it is highly idealized. If it is researched within academia, it is usually researched in a very conservative way by literary historians, and it is definitely under-researched from the translation studies perspective. There is actually only one study, and I will come back to that later because it was my starting point, in fact. I decided to investigate this particular periodical and this particular period using translation studies tools and using the notion of translation policy understood in a very broad terms, because I believe that I just put some names, I'm sure you are all familiar with them. There were different attempts to name and identify, trace sociology of translation and translation history. There were some integrated approaches, and that is something that is the closest to my heart. However, if I have to choose, I would probably choose the translation history, because I think that the potential of integration within translation history nowadays, especially in the Polish context, is very big. And what I wanted to stress in the definition of translation policies proposed by Rein Maillard is the inclusion of all possible actors. That is something I will elaborate on later. Also, I wanted to provide you with my definition. Well, not the definition I want to use. The definition of translation is not entirely mine. So we can treat translation as a historical product that serves a specific function within the target culture and as a complex process of cultural transfer involving institutions and individuals. Again, we have those actors. And it was obviously stressed, for example, by Anthony Pym in his seminal method in translation history. And in the same publication, he stressed the fact that translation history is not only and even not primarily interested in past, but actually, as usually history does, it is interested in present and maybe even in future, in order to understand the current situation, for example. So this is the first reason why I decided to choose translation history. And here I wanted to share with you the quotation from Christopher Rundle. You probably are familiar with this quote. Rundle is very much in favor of the conception of extending the audience of translation historians into historians as such, as a discipline, into history. Let's say conventional history, because very often it is the case that it's easier to engage with each other in a constructive dialogue. It is easy to understand because sometimes for people who are, for example, interested in audiovisual translation or multimodality, it is not that easy to contribute in the discussion on particular historical period, for example. And I also listed 3 publications, quite recent publications, which are also an evidence for me that this integrated global approach is important within translation history. The first one was inspired by postcolonial studies, the second one by feminist studies, and the third one by global history. And I would like to especially draw your attention to the title of the last publication, A History of Modern Translation Knowledge. Livendielst and Yves Combier extended the notion of translation studies as a discipline into the broader knowledge, more inclusive knowledge, where we can also investigate something that is not entirely within academia, for example. And the last point I want to make in this methodological section refers to the distinction between primary and secondary sources in translation history. Jeremy Mundy said that there is this blurring line between them in translation history, in archives in general, in relation to translation history. Because, for example, when we analyze the material, the press materials, for example, reviews, we shouldn't treat them as primary sources. Very often they are signs of some kind of political underpinnings, for example. And it is particularly important when we want to study periodicals, because the content is not, sometimes is not as important as the form. In periodicals, it was also called syntax. I would like to start from this level of interpretation while talking about my case study. And I would like to come back to what I said about primary and secondary sources, because actually, as I mentioned, there was this one study, one research conducted on that period from the translation studies perspective in 2006. It was made by Jan Wnęk, and the title of the book is Polskie przekłady literatury zagranicznej, Polish translations of foreign literature. And he identified 9,826 works translated into Polish from various languages in those 2 decades. But he actually stopped at this statistical approach. And I would like to start my research when he stopped his own research. So I would like to build on this statistical approach and trace some fluctuations and also some reasons behind that. Vneng did refer to the annual very extensively, but he treated it as a primary source. He did not analyze it as a highly subjective, collaborative, complex body of works of various editors and reviewers, a collection of individual policies that were changing throughout time. And here are two tables of contents. Obviously, the letters are very small and they're all in Polish, but even at this very level of the volume, you can see that there were differences within time. Rocznik Literacki consisted of 8 respective issues published by the Literary Institute in Warsaw, and it presented the urge of editors to classify the entire literary production, both original and translated. The annual was aimed at reaching wide and diversified audiences, common readers, translators and publishers, recipients with different interests, knowledge and needs. Also, the authorship varied. Editors of the annual invited eminent literary historians, translators and philologists to create their own subsections. Respective issues varied in categories and volume, but always included a bibliography of works written in Polish, works translated from various languages, reviews of travel books, diaries, children's books, essays on current trends in literary studies, philosophy, and the report on the press market. And what is particularly interesting is that the section devoted to translated literature was extensive, and it was divided into different subsections. In the course of journal's operation, following subsections appeared: English, Spanish, Yugoslavian, later called Slavic, French, Russian, German, Hungarian, Italian, Romanian, Scandinavian, including Norwegian, Danish, and Swedish, Latin and Greek, Yiddish, Dutch, and Lithuanian. Some of them appeared regularly, some of them only once. The very division into languages or national literatures was arbitrary, and it was changing. It was visible especially with the English literature, because it started with the division into English and American literature. Later they were matched together. Later the Canadian literature appeared as well. General strategies towards translations that we can call translation policies presented in the annual were in line with the model identified by Christopher Rundle in his study on fascist Italy. So in general, translation was seen as a sign of lack of power and prestige. Reviewers were interested in a wider literary production in Polish so that the local audience would not need foreign books. The exception was the children literature, where it was acceptable to translate works from Western Europe. Reviewers responsible for the translation section in the annual tried to create a new unifying tradition in order to support national identity through translation. As it was stated in the introductory essay to the first issue of the periodical, the aim of the publication was an ample presentation and unbiased evaluation of literary works in Poland in the 1930s. The reviewers of translation in the annual argued that translation choices should be made very carefully in order not to contaminate the language and corrupt the audience. One of the reviewers even proposed a set of questions, which I translated and copied for you. Was the translation informative? Was it faithful rendition of the original? Were linguistic norms of the Polish language respected? Did translators understand correctly the source text? Did they master the target language? And reviewers attacked actually not only translators who did not fulfill the rules just presented by me, but also publishers who selected foreign books for translation, which were either difficult to understand outside the local context or lacking artistic values, whatever it means. The works worthy of translating would have to be chosen with respect to the aesthetical trends they introduced. So the English novel was the most attractive, but at the same time, the most difficult genre to translate. Translation was also acceptable if it addressed universal issues delivered in a standard Polish language. Here, it was particularly important to avoid loanwords, false friends, and to domesticate proper names to maintain the impression that the text was written in Polish. In fact, that was considered an indicator of the perfect translation. In terms of norms, reviewers agreed that the quality of translation depends on the degree to which translator is familiar with the cultural context of the work. The main aim of translated text would be to bring the reader of the target text closer to the source culture. Omissions were in fact acceptable as long as they were caused by the awareness of the issues potentially controversial in the target culture. When they were caused by the lack of understanding of the context, translators were criticized. The activity of the reviewers can be seen as a way to redress the mistakes made by translators. They often provide a wide audience with the reception of the original, or even suggest their own rendition of the source text. There was this very visible missionary character of their work in order to stop the random and chaotic translation policy. And also they aimed at raising the awareness of the general audience by simultaneously ameliorating the linguistic level of translations and, as a result, professionalizing the occupation of the translator. Here I would like to just briefly show you two fluctuations that happened during the journal's operation in the 30s. So in the third issue, there was introduced a new subsection devoted to the translations from Latin and Greek. And 2 years later, it was actually announced, but 2 years later, there was this silent exclusion of translation from Yiddish. So the discontinuation of the subsection devoted to what was called Jewish literature. However, the Jewish question appeared in Rocznik Literacki in a different section, in a section sacrificed to literary life in Poland, led by Piotr Grzegorczyk. And Piotr Grzegorczyk was an editor, a bibliographer, and a columnist, particularly attentive to the issues of national minorities in Poland. Firstly, he was an author of the section devoted to translations of Polish literature into foreign languages. But in the last 2 volumes, he created a new chapter centered on the literary life in Poland. In both sections, he was actually very aware of the impact of translation on other fields of social life. And his ambition, clearly manifested throughout the entire period of journal operation, was to establish a strong position of Polish culture in Europe. He was very much aware of the interrelations between non-literary circumstances and translation, which can be visible in the quotation I translated for you. And for him, a serious threat to the international career of the Polish state was the fact that Polish authors were glorified for their hermetic, moralistic, strongly national position. His attitude towards socio-cultural mechanisms of reception was quite innovative because he paid attention not only to the literary production, but also to the consumption of literature. He also said that it would be good to attract other nations by inviting them to Poland and proposing them trips to Poland, that it could be the way to make them interested in Polish language and Polish culture. And to conclude, I would like to say that, in my opinion, Rocznik Literacki was created with the hope of developing regulations and norms for literature and translation in order to stop the chaotic and random moves within the literary market in Poland, the nation in search for its identity, questioning the present, reinventing the past, and imagining the future. Editors of the annual believe that they can recreate tradition not only by evaluating existing strategies, but also by suggesting possible directions for the development of Polish culture. Thus, they believe that the annual should not be considered a summary, but instead a projection based on the aspiration of the Polish state to be a part of Western Europe. As I tried to show, it was not a coherent version, but rather a cluster of mixed, often contradictory views towards translation. Thanks to the interdisciplinary framework, translation can be identified in seemingly monolingual Polish literary journal and seen as an important interpretative key in the construction of historical narratives of a form, a given sociocultural context. These are my references. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this fascinating talk. I'm a historian as well, so I am especially interested, and also I think that my country, Hungary, has a very similar history, also in translation between the interwar, between the two world wars. So yes, it's very good to see that translation wasn't regulated at that time. Therefore, it became very chaotic, and lots of people could try out their hands. And actually, you have the whole society, all the ideas, all the ideologies, whatever, in the translations. And I'm very interested that now, when people idealize this period, do they turn back to the translation norms of that time, and do they try to imitate the interwar period in this respect as well, or translations are much more regulated now?
That's a very good question. I think that there is no one answer, but my general observation is that in Poland, we kind of came back to the interwar periods in a way in our discourse, in the way we capture our thoughts in public debates. Also, the very core of the debate is, I would say, very similar to that time. Even this language of contamination, for example, is still used or is used again. And I think that it is obviously a part of the politics of memory as well. So there are some figures that are political figures, for example, that are much more comfortable to remember in line with the, let's say, political atmosphere in Poland right now. But in terms of translation, I think that right now the market, I would say, is quite chaotic, obviously much more regulated, still chaotic, but for different reasons, I would say.
Yeah. Okay.
So it's much. I would say just the because of the market as such, it is chaotic, and also I think that there is one leading narrative, kind of idealistic narrative about the figure of translator and the role of literary translation, but the practice is maybe not the opposite, but is not the same. It's definitely not in line. It's somewhere, maybe it's parallel, let's say, but it's not in the same line.
And what is the image of literary translators in Poland in that period and now? I would like to have a sort of comparison between the two, if you don't mind.
Yeah, I mean, I'm actually, the part of my research is devoted to microhistories of female translators from that time, especially Jewish female translators, because there were many of them. And female translators were the majority, and they still are a majority of translators. However, obviously, this main picture of a well-educated, while male poet, artist is very strong, and there is a huge proliferation between this theory or this small group of people who can actually choose what they want to translate and whose names are recognized because there are, for example, poets themselves or academics. But there is a literary translators association in Poland, and it is a brilliant initiative. I think it was established in 2010, and they are very inclusive, and they work towards changing this idealistic vision of only one type of translator. As Pim identified, it was the case in the interwar period, and it is still the case that translators usually do other things than translate. at the same time. They travel, sometimes they stop translating, and there are some reasons behind that as well. And the economic situation of Polish translator wasn't good and isn't good, I would say, still. So that's why of the reason why there are usually people who do other things, not only translate.
I think there is a huge difference between the average literary translator and the literary translator who himself or herself or themselves poets or playwrights or novelists. They are much more acknowledged, and and of course they are treated differently in society. So usually their translations are just mentioned as a side activity, not the really important one. And perhaps this is the reason why the literary translators majority are women, of course, female. But still, when we are talking about the literary translators in Poland or even in Hungary, it's always the man and the poet and the famous. It's lovely. And how do you intend to develop this project? Because I got the impression that it was just a part of your research.
Yes, I mean, I'm doing my PhD right now, and I started from recognizing the field, let's say, and finally I decided to gather microhistories of different translators from that period. But I kind of started from periodicals, because in the interwar period, periodicals were very strong agendas of different views, political views, social views, and also the language used in periodicals was very powerful and influential, I would say, for the public at that time. But because periodicals as such are such a complex body of different voices, I decided to focus on microhistories at this point, but I will definitely, well, I hopefully will develop both sides of this project.
And is it true that periodicals were freer? They had much more liberty to do to experiment, for instance.
Yes, I mean, they were more difficult to control, and sometimes they were very ephemerical. They just appeared and disappeared, and there was a new one emerging periodical with the same editorial board, for example, or partly the same editorial board. So it was easier to change the name, to dress up and pretend that the agenda is different, definitely.
Okay. I checked whether you got questions, but it seems there are no questions. So we can talk about your project a bit longer if you
Maybe one thing I wanted to say in relation to the relationships between different types of translators nowadays. I think 3 or 4 years ago, there was this discussion between a very eminent poet and translator, actually a translator of James Joyce as well, who is a very well-established artist, who criticized, let's say, average translators for translated books, I don't know, crime novels, for example, that it is, again, this contamination, this spoiling the nation, this producing kind of rubbish literature that is not changing the course of history. And the association I mentioned wanted to defend those ordinary translators. They were actually from that circle. They were female as well. And there was a very interesting, I would say, mainly on the internet, there was this debate. And it was one of these moments then, let's say, general public could hear something more within the society, as let's say the translators themselves, because they are still not given voice, those ordinary translators.
It happens in conservative societies. They think that everything is contaminating their ethics and traditions and whatever, what literary translators translate into their language. unfortunately. Thank you very much. I really enjoyed it, and good luck with your project. Yeah.
Thank you very much.